Have you heard of the man who built a dress out of human flesh? What about a lampshade out of the skin from a skull? In the annals of true crime, few names evoke as much terror as Ed Gein, a man whose horrifying deeds not only shocked a nation, but also laid the foundation for some of the most iconic horror films of all time. Texas Chain Saw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, all these films, and many more, draw from the twisted reality of Ed Gein. But how did a quiet man from rural Wisconsin become the template for cinematic nightmares? To understand the monster, we must first explore the man, beginning with the roots of his madness. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in Lake Cross County, Wisconsin. The second of two sons, Ed grew up in a household dominated by his mother, Augusta, a fanatically religious woman. Augusta's iron grip on the family would shape the rest of Ed's life. She preached that women were the root of all evil, instilling a deep-seated fear and disgust toward them in her son. The Gein family lived on an isolated farm in Plainfield, where Ed's contact with the outside world was severely limited. This isolation, combined with Augusta's oppressive influence, laid the groundwork for the horrors that would later unfold. Augusta Gein was more than just a strict parent. She was a religious zealot who believed that the world was filled with sin, especially women, whom she considered the embodiment of evil. She often read to her sons from the Bible, focusing on passages that condemned women and emphasized the punishment for sinners. Augusta drilled into Ed that women were unclean and that he should avoid them at all costs. This relentless indoctrination left a deep psychological scar on young Ed, instilling in him a profound fear and loathing of women. One particularly telling incident occurred when Ed was a child. Augusta caught him trying to make friends with a neighborhood girl. Furious, she berated him for what she saw as fraternizing with filth. She warned him that all women, except for her, were instruments of the devil and that associating with them would damn his soul. This event was just one of many that reinforced Ed's unhealthy dependence on his mother and his twisted view of women as both objects of desire and disgust. Augusta's control over Ed extended to every aspect of his life. She forbade him from having any close relationships outside of the family, ensuring that he remained emotionally stunted and socially isolated. Her influence was so pervasive that even after her death, Ed continued to hear her voice in his head, guiding his actions and decisions. The shrine he created in her memory was not just a tribute, but a sign of how deeply her teachings had penetrated his psyche. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and deeply attached to his mother. His father, George, was a weak and ineffectual figure, frequently drunk and unable to stand up to Augusta. When George died in 1940, followed by Ed's older brother Henry under mysterious circumstances, Augusta's control over Ed became absolute. When she passed away in 1945, Ed was devastated. Alone on the farm, his mind began to unravel. After Augusta's death, Ed's life spiraled into madness. He became increasingly isolated, rarely leaving the family farm. Inside the farmhouse, Ed created a shrine to his deceased mother, preserving her room as a sacred space while the rest of the house fell into disrepair. It was during this time that Ed began to indulge in macabre fantasies, drawn to the morbid and grotesque. He started visiting local cemeteries at night, exhuming bodies and bringing them back to his home. These gruesome activities marked the beginning of Ed Gein's descent into darkness. Psychologists and criminologists have long studied Ed Gein's case, offering various theories about the underlying causes of his disturbing behavior. Some experts have suggested that Gein may have suffered from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder characterized by distorted thinking, delusions, and hallucinations. Others believe he exhibited signs of psychopathy, particularly in his inability to form normal human relationships and his lack of empathy for his victims. Gein's childhood trauma, particularly the toxic relationship with his mother, played a significant role in shaping his psyche. Modern psychology suggests that the emotional and psychological abuse he endured created deep-seated issues that manifested in his later actions. The isolation imposed by Augusta, combined with her rigid and punitive religious teachings, may have led to a form of disorganized attachment, where Gein's understanding of love and relationships became profoundly distorted. Experts also propose that Gein's actions can be understood through the lens of trauma and dissociation. The severe emotional trauma he experienced, especially following his mother's death, may have caused him to disassociate from reality. In his mind, he may have believed that by wearing the skin of his victims, he could bring his mother back or even become her, maintaining the only relationship that had ever mattered to him. Some psychological theories also explore the idea of maternal enmeshment, where a child's identity becomes so entwined with their mother's that they lose their sense of self. This could explain why Gein was unable to function independently after Augusta's death, leading him to extreme behaviors in an attempt to fill the void she left behind. Modern psychology offers insights into what might have been done to prevent Ed Gein's descent into madness. Early intervention and mental health care, had they been available or accepted in Gein's rural community, might have made a difference. Addressing the signs of trauma and providing him with a stable, supportive environment could have altered the course of his life. However, in the 1940s and 50s, mental health issues were often misunderstood or ignored, especially in isolated, rural areas like Plainfield, Wisconsin. The intersection of childhood trauma, isolation, and mental illness in Ed Gein's case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of early psychological intervention. His story is a tragic example of how untreated mental health issues can lead to unimaginable horrors. Ed Gein's crimes came to light on November 16, 1957, when local hardware store owner Bernice Worden went missing. Suspicion quickly fell on Gein, and when police entered his home, they uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Worden's decapitated body was found hanging in a shed, and the house itself was filled with body parts, human skin, and other grotesque trophies taken from his victims and the graves he had robbed. The investigation into Ed Gein's crimes was a challenging and complex process, marked by a series of critical turning points and the use of emerging forensic techniques. When Bernice Worden was reported missing, local police began their investigation with the usual procedures, interviewing witnesses and searching for any immediate clues. However, it was the discovery of a sales slip in the hardware store, indicating that Gein had been the last customer before Worden's disappearance, that first directed suspicion toward him. Upon arriving at Gein's farm, police were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The initial search of the property revealed the decapitated body of Bernice Worden, hung like a slaughtered animal in the shed. But this was only the beginning. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officers uncovered a house filled with items made from human remains, skulls used as bowls, a belt made of nipples, and masks crafted from the skin of Gein's victims. The extent of Gein's crimes required a thorough and meticulous investigation. Forensic techniques, though rudimentary by today's standards, played a crucial role in piecing together the full extent of Gein's activities. Investigators carefully cataloged and analyzed the remains found in Gein's home, working to identify the victims and determine how they had been killed. This process was painstaking, as many of the remains were in various states of decomposition or had been repurposed into grotesque household items. Interviews with local residents provided additional insight into Gein's activities. Neighbors recalled seeing strange behavior, such as Gein making frequent trips to local cemeteries and bringing back mysterious loads late at night. However, in the close-knit community of Plainfield, these oddities were often dismissed as eccentricities rather than red flags. It wasn't until the full extent of Gein's crimes was uncovered that the community and law enforcement realized just how dangerous he had been. One of the significant challenges faced by law enforcement was the sheer scale of Gein's activities. The discovery of body parts and human remains scattered throughout the house presented a logistical nightmare. Investigators had to determine which remains belonged to which victims, a process complicated by the fact that Gein had exhumed many of the bodies from local cemeteries. The use of forensic anthropology became crucial in this effort, as experts worked to reconstruct the identities of the victims and understand the timeline of Gein's actions. Another turning point in the investigation was Gein's own confession. Though initially reluctant to speak, Gein eventually provided a detailed account of his activities, including how he would exhume recently buried bodies and use their skin and bones for his macabre crafts. His calm and matter-of-fact demeanor during these confessions shocked investigators, revealing a man who had become completely detached from the horrors he was describing. The investigation into Ed Gein's crimes was not only a pivotal moment in law enforcement, but also in the field of forensic science. It highlighted the importance of forensic analysis in solving crimes of this nature and set the stage for future developments in the field. The challenges faced by the police, from identifying victims to piecing together Gein's motivations, underscored the complexity of dealing with a criminal as disturbed as Gein. Ultimately, the case of Ed Gein remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. The thoroughness of the investigation and the emerging role of forensics were key in bringing Gein's horrific actions to light, ensuring that his crimes would never be forgotten. Ed Gein was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but his trial would focus not only on his guilt, but also on his sanity. Gein's lawyers argued that he was insane, and after a psychological evaluation, he was declared unfit to stand trial. Gein was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he would spend the rest of his life. Throughout his time in the institution, Ed Gein remained a model patient, never expressing any remorse for his actions. But what was life like for Gein after the horrors he had committed were brought to light? How did this quiet, disturbed man spend his remaining years in a place designed to house the criminally insane? At the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, Gein's behavior was surprisingly subdued. Unlike many other patients with severe mental illnesses, Gein was generally quiet, cooperative, and even helpful around the facility. He took on various tasks, such as cleaning and maintenance work, often keeping to himself and avoiding conflict with other patients. His demeanor was described by staff as calm and compliant, almost as if he had finally found a place where he could exist without the pressures and expectations of the outside world. Despite the severity of his crimes, Gein seemed to adapt well to the structured environment of the institution. He followed the rules, participated in routine activities, and rarely caused any disturbances. His interactions with staff were polite but distant. He never fully engaged in conversations or displayed much emotion. This lack of emotional response was consistent with the detachment he had shown during his confessions, further suggesting a deep psychological disconnect from the reality of his actions. Gein's relationships with other patients were minimal. He did not form close friendships or participate in group activities beyond what was required. Most other patients, aware of his notoriety, kept their distance, and Gein seemed content to remain isolated. There were few, if any, reports of aggressive behavior or outbursts from him during his years at the institution. As for rehabilitation or therapy, the efforts were limited. In the 1950s and 60s, mental health treatment, particularly for someone with Gein's history, was not as advanced or as compassionate as it might be today. Gein was subjected to standard psychiatric evaluations and occasional therapy sessions, but there was little hope or expectation that he could be cured of his deep-seated psychological issues. The focus was more on managing his behavior and ensuring he did not pose a threat to himself or others within the institution. Gein's life in the institution was, in many ways, a reflection of his life before his crimes were uncovered, isolated, routine, and devoid of deep emotional connections. The only difference was that the setting had changed from a decrepit farmhouse to a sterile, controlled environment. He continued to live out his days in relative obscurity, his notorious past largely hidden from those around him. Ed Gein remained at Central State Hospital until 1978, when he was transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute. His final years were marked by declining health, and in 1984, he died of respiratory failure due to lung cancer. Despite the horrors he had inflicted upon others, Gein passed away quietly and without fanfare, buried in an unmarked grave, much like the victims he had desecrated in life. Ed Gein's life in the mental institution offers a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who, despite his heinous crimes, found a strange sense of peace in confinement. His story is a stark reminder of the complexities of mental illness and the dark paths it can lead to when left unchecked. Ed Gein's crimes left a lasting impact, not just on the small town of Plainfield, but on American culture as a whole. His story became the inspiration for some of the most iconic horror films ever made. Texas Chain Saw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho all draw from the horrifying reality of Ed Gein's life. But Ed Gein's influence reaches far beyond the silver screen. His gruesome story has permeated literature, music, and even the true crime genre itself. Authors and musicians have found in Gein's life a dark muse, one that speaks to the more macabre elements of human nature. His case has inspired numerous books, both fictional and non-fictional, exploring everything from the psychological motivations behind his crimes to speculative fiction about what might have driven him to such extremes. One notable example is Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, which, though primarily known through its film adaptation, began as a chilling piece of literature inspired by the Gein case. Bloch was intrigued by the idea of a killer who could appear so ordinary and yet harbor such dark secrets. The novel's portrayal of Norman Bates as a seemingly harmless man living a double life as a brutal murderer struck a chord with readers, cementing Gein's influence in the world of literature. In the world of music, Gein's story has also left its mark. Various bands, particularly in the metal and punk genres, have referenced Gein in their lyrics, often using his story as a symbol of the extremes of human depravity. Songs like Slayer's Dead Skin Mask and Mudvayne's Nothing to Gein are directly inspired by his life and crimes, turning Gein into a cultural icon of horror and shock. Beyond individual works, Gein's influence can be seen in the broader true crime genre itself. His case, one of the first to receive widespread media attention, helped to popularize true crime as a form of entertainment. The sensationalism surrounding Gein's trial and the subsequent public fascination with his life set a precedent for how true crime stories are told and consumed. Today, Gein's legacy lives on in the countless documentaries, podcasts, and books that explore the darkest corners of human behavior. Even outside of horror and true crime, Ed Gein's story has become a part of American folklore, a cautionary tale of what can happen when madness goes unchecked. His life and crimes have been referenced in everything from TV shows to video games, solidifying his place as one of the most infamous figures in modern history. Gein's name has become synonymous with the macabre, a symbol of the thin line between the mundane and the monstrous. Ed Gein's impact on popular culture is both profound and unsettling. He serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives, and his story continues to captivate and horrify audiences around the world. Ed Gein's case raises unsettling questions about the nature of madness and the fine line between fascination and horror. His actions challenge our understanding of mental illness, isolation, and the darker aspects of human nature. How does society deal with individuals like Gein? Are we fascinated by the macabre, or are we seeking to understand the roots of such darkness? To fully grasp Ed Gein's place in the history of crime, it's important to compare him with other notorious figures of his time and later. Unlike many serial killers, Gein's crimes were not driven by a desire for power or control over others, but by a deeply disturbed psychological need to reconnect with his deceased mother. This sets him apart from killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, who derived pleasure from the suffering of their victims. Gein's actions also differed in the methodical way he carried out his macabre activities. While others sought notoriety or sexual gratification, Gein seemed almost unaware of the moral gravity of his deeds. His case shares some similarities with that of Jeffrey Dahmer, who also kept gruesome trophies from his victims. But where Dahmer's actions were linked to his twisted sexual fantasies, Gein's were rooted in a distorted form of grief and a desire to physically embody his mother. The uniqueness of Gein's case lies in its raw, primal horror, the idea that someone could commit such atrocities not out of malice, but out of a warped sense of love and loss. This is perhaps why Gein's story continues to resonate so deeply in our cultural psyche. His crimes tap into fundamental fears about identity, death, and the fragility of the human mind. As we delve into these questions, we must also consider the ethical implications of turning real-life horror into entertainment. Ed Gein's story is more than just a tale of terror. It's a reflection of our own fears and the darkest corners of the human psyche. How do we reconcile our fascination with such horror with the real suffering that it represents? Ed Gein was a man whose life was shaped by isolation, madness, and an unbreakable bond with a controlling mother. His story is one of horror, not just for the gruesome crimes he committed, but for the unsettling truths it reveals about the human condition. As we continue to explore the darkest parts of history, we must remember that behind every legend, every terrifying tale, lies the story of a real person. Ed Gein's life may be the stuff of nightmares, but it's a nightmare that was all too real. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey into the mind of Ed Gein. If you found this exploration chilling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history's most disturbing events. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious, and as always we leave you with this reminder that once you enter the dark you may never be the same.
See on Chambliss. Free me men playing with the dead, wearing skin like it's a threat. Ed Gein, a horror king, inspiring movies, the darkest things. Oh Ed, you're a lech, no admiration, just a wretch. Creepy man in the shadows he hides, twisting tales where darkness resides. Ed Gein, a macabre mind, searching for what he can find. Creepy man with a sinister grin, delving into the darkness within. Oh Ed, you're a lech. No admiration, just a wretch. Creepy man in the shadows he hides, twisting tales where darkness resides. Shadows dance, whispers in the night. Ed Gein's legacy, a chilling sight. Shadows dance, whispers in the night. Ed Gein's legacy, a chilling sight. Oh Ed, you're a lech. No admiration, just a wretch. Creepy man in the shadows he hides, twisting tales where darkness resides.